The skull sits in a museum drawer in Kenya, brown and weathered, roughly 10,000 years old. At first glance it looks like thousands of other ancient human remains, teeth worn down from grinding wild grains, eye sockets staring at nothing, the familiar architecture of mortality. But then you notice something that shouldn't be there. Embedded in the left side of the cranium, still lodged in the bone after 10 millennia, is a stone projectile point. An arrow. Someone shot this person in the head, and whoever they were, they never got up again. This isn't a warrior buried with weapons. This isn't ceremonial. The angle is wrong, the placement too precise. This is murder preserved in calcium and time, the first blood frozen in stone. Now you might think this is just an isolated tragedy, one bad day 10,000 years ago. But this skull isn't alone. There are others. Mass graves from ancient lakesides where men, women and children were massacred and left where they fell. Skeletons with healed fractures showing repeated trauma over lifetimes. Fortifications built when the world was supposedly peaceful. Evidence of violence stretching back through the archaeological record until it fades into the shadows, where evidence itself becomes too rare to read. Which brings us to the question that's haunted anthropologists, historians, and philosophers for generations. Were we born this way? Is violence written into our DNA like the chromosome fusion we carry from our near extinction? Or is warfare something we invented, a terrible technology we developed along the way, like fire or agriculture? Did our ancestors climb down from the trees already carrying the seeds of war in their hearts? Or were we once noble savages, living in harmony until civilization corrupted us? The answer, it turns out, is far stranger than either extreme, and the journey to find it takes us 500,000 years into the past, to a time when humans weren't even really human yet, not the way we think of ourselves today. If you're settling in for this journey, good. That's exactly what this is for, a deep dive through the longest crime scene in history. The story of how we learn to kill each other, told slowly, carefully, in the kind of detail that lets your mind wander through ancient landscapes while your body finally relaxes. If you're listening in the dark, in bed, half asleep already, perfect. And hey, drop a comment and tell me where you are right now and what time it is there. I genuinely love seeing it. Singapore at sunrise, London at midnight, São Paulo at dinner time. All of us, scattered across the globe, tracing the bloody thread that connects us all back to the beginning. The story we're about to explore isn't the one you learned in school. It's not the simple narrative of brutish cavemen clubbing each other over the head. Nor is it the romantic fantasy of peaceful hunter-gatherers living in ecological balance until agriculture ruined everything. The truth, as always, is more complicated, more human, more unsettling. We're going to start 500,000 years ago, when our ancestors were still figuring out what it meant to be human. We'll track them through ice ages and migrations, through the evolution of new species and the extinction of old ones. We'll watch as simple tools become sophisticated weapons, as small bands become tribes, as tribes become societies, as societies become civilizations, and somewhere in that long, winding journey, we'll see the moment when killing stopped being something that just happened and became something we organized, something we planned, something we got good at. The archaeological evidence is fragmentary, maddeningly incomplete. For every skull with an arrowhead embedded in it, there are 10,000 ancient deaths that left no trace. Violence doesn't always leave marks on bones. A spear through the chest kills just as dead as a blow to the head, but soft tissue decays, and suddenly we're blind to what really happened. So we'll have to be detectives, piecing together clues from scattered graves and broken weapons, from cave paintings and fortified settlements, from the very structure of ancient societies themselves. What we'll find challenges everything The gentle foragers weren't always gentle. The violent warriors weren't always violent. Human nature isn't a fixed thing carved in stone like that ancient arrowhead. It's something flexible, something that changes depending on circumstances, on environment, on culture, on whether there's enough food to go around or whether your neighbours want what you have. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand why humans start killing each other, we need to understand where we came from, who we were before the first blood was spilled, what made us capable of organised violence in the first place. So, let's go back, way back. 500,000 years into the shadows, where the evidence is thin and the questions are thick. Back to when our ancestors were still deciding what kind of creature they wanted to become. 1953. The world is still reeling from the atomic bombs that ended World War II. Everyone's terrified that humanity might just annihilate itself. The Cold War is heating up. Nuclear stockpiles are growing, and people are asking uncomfortable questions about human nature. Are we inherently violent? Is war inevitable? Were we always killers? Into this anxious world steps Raymond Dart, an Australian anatomist working in South Africa. He's been studying fossils from a limestone quarry at Taung, and he's made some discoveries that seem to confirm everyone's worst fears about ourselves. In his hands are the skulls of ancient creatures called Australopithecus africanus, our distant ancestors who walked upright across African grasslands nearly 3 million years ago. And these skulls, Dart claims, tell a story of murder. Look at this one, he says. See that depression in the bone? That's not natural wear. That's not an accident. That's the result of a deliberate blow from a weapon, probably a bone club wielded by another Australopithecine. And this fracture here, another killing blow, and this one. The same pattern, the same violence, the same evidence of our species' original sin. Dart wasn't just looking at Australopithecine skulls either. He was examining the bones of baboons found in the same deposits, animals that would have shared the landscape with our ancestors. Many of these baboon skulls showed similar fractures, similar damage patterns, and scattered among them were bones that Dart believed had been fashioned into tools and weapons, antelope leg bones that could serve as clubs, jaw bones with teeth still attached that might function as cutting implements. From this evidence, Dart constructed a theory that would capture the imagination of the post-war world. He called it the killer ape hypothesis. Our ancestors, he argued, were not peaceful gatherers occasionally forced to defend themselves. They were predators, aggressive hunters who used bone weapons to kill both prey animals and each other. Violence wasn't something humans learned. It was our original nature, hardwired into us by millions of years of murderous evolution. The theory spread like wildfire, not just in academic circles, but in popular culture, where it resonated with Cold War fears about human destructiveness. In 1961, Robert Ardrey, a playwright-turned-science writer, published African Genesis, a best-selling book that popularized Dart's ideas for mass audiences. Humans were born with weapons in their hands, Ardrey claimed, shaped by countless generations of killing. War wasn't a cultural invention. It was our biological destiny. Then, in 1968, Stanley Kubrick's film 2001, A Space Odyssey opened with one of cinema's most famous sequences. An Australopithecine discovers he can use a bone as a weapon. He kills a rival with it, and in a moment of triumph, he hurls the bone into the air, where it transforms into a spacecraft. 4 million years of human history condensed into a single edit. The message was clear. We went from killer apes to spacefaring civilization, but we never stopped being killers. We just got better weapons. The killer ape theory became embedded in popular consciousness. It showed up in academic papers, documentaries, novels, films. It gave people a simple, compelling answer to the question of why humans wage war. We do it because we've always done it, because it's written in our DNA, because 3 million years ago our ancestors picked up bones and started bashing each other's heads in. But there was a problem. The theory was wrong. Completely, demonstrably, scientifically wrong. The unravelling began slowly with researchers who actually looked carefully at Dart's evidence. They started with those baboon skulls, the ones with the supposed murder fractures. When forensic specialists examined them using modern techniques, they noticed something Dart had missed. The fracture patterns weren't consistent with being struck by bone clubs or any other handheld weapon. They were consistent with something else entirely. Leopard bites. You see, leopards are ambush predators. They kill by grabbing prey animals by the head and crushing the skull with their powerful jaws. When they do this, they leave very specific puncture marks and fracture patterns. The spacing matches their canine teeth. The force vectors match a bite, not a blow. And when researchers compared the damage on Dart's baboon skulls to skulls of modern baboons killed by leopards, the match was perfect. Those Australopithecines weren't hunting baboons with bone clubs. They were being hunted by leopards alongside the baboons. The limestone quarry at Taung wasn't an ancient murder scene. It was a leopard's den, a place where the big cat dragged its kills to eat in safety. The bones accumulating there weren't weapons. They were leftovers. But the debunking didn't stop there. Researchers started examining the supposed bone tools and weapons Dart had identified. When they looked closely, they found no evidence of modification, no signs that these bones had been deliberately shaped or sharpened. No wear patterns consistent with use as tools. What they did find was evidence of carnivore chewing, weathering, and natural breakage. This led to the development of an entirely new field of study called taphonomy, the science of understanding what happens to remains after death. Taphonomists learned to distinguish between damage caused by humans and damage caused by natural processes, between bones broken by stone tools and bones broken by carnivores, between murder victims and predator prey. When they applied these new techniques to Dart's evidence, the killer ape theory collapsed. Those fractures on Australopithecine skulls. Some were from predator attacks. Others were from rocks falling in cave systems. Others were from geological pressure that fractured bones over millions of years. None showed the clear signatures of interpersonal violence that would be expected if these were murder victims. By the 1970s and 80s, most paleoanthropologists had abandoned the killer ape hypothesis. The evidence didn't support it. Our Australopithecine ancestors weren't apex predators armed with bone weapons. They were relatively small, vulnerable creatures who spent a lot of time trying not to get eaten by leopards, hyenas, and saber-toothed cats. But here's the fascinating part. Even as the scientific community rejected Dart's theory, it remained incredibly popular in public imagination. Books and documentaries continued repeating the killer ape story decades after it had been debunked. Films kept showing our ancestors as violent predators. Even some scientists in other fields continued citing Dart's work as if it were still valid. Why? Why did this disproven theory have such staying power? Part of it was timing. Dart's theory emerged at exactly the moment when people needed an explanation for human violence. The horrors of World War II, the atomic bombs, the Holocaust, the emerging Cold War. All of this created intense anxiety about human nature. If humans were naturally violent, if we were killer apes who couldn't help ourselves, then maybe these atrocities weren't aberrations. Maybe they were inevitable. It was a comforting thought in a perverse way. If violence is in our nature, we can't be blamed for it. The theory also fit perfectly with prevailing ideas about evolution and competition. This was the era of nature red in tooth and claw, when evolution was understood primarily through the lens of violent struggle. Survival of the fittest meant the most aggressive survived. Natural selection meant competition, conflict, killing. Dart's killer apes fit this narrative perfectly, and there's something viscerally compelling about the image itself. The bone weapon, the murder at the dawn of humanity, the unbroken line of violence from Australopithecines to atomic bombs. It's dramatic, it's cinematic. It tells a clear, simple story about who we are and where we came from. But simple stories are often wrong, and this one was spectacularly wrong. The real story of human violence, as we're about to discover, is far more complex and far more interesting than the killer ape theory ever suggested. Our ancestors weren't born with weapons in their hands and murder in their hearts. For most of human prehistory, for hundreds of thousands of years, we have very little clear evidence of systematic interpersonal violence. No massacres, no weapons specifically designed to kill other humans, no fortifications built to defend against human attackers. This doesn't mean our ancestors were peaceful saints living in prehistoric paradise. Life was hard. Resources were scarce. People certainly died violent deaths sometimes. But there's a crucial difference between occasional violence and the systematic, organised warfare that would eventually emerge. So if Raymond Dart was wrong, if we weren't killer apes from the beginning, then when did organised violence actually start? When did humans begin deliberately, systematically killing each other? When did war begin? To answer that question, we need to go back, way back. We need to trace human evolution from those Australopithecines in their leopard-haunted caves forward through time. We need to look at the actual archaeological evidence, not fanciful theories, but real bones, real weapons, real proof of violence preserved in stone and soil. We need to understand what our ancestors were actually like before we can understand how and why they changed. Before we can explain war, we need to reconstruct peace, or at least the absence of war. We need to see what 500,000 years of human existence looked like before the killing began in earnest. So let's leave Dart's fractured skulls behind. Let's abandon the killer ape theory to the dustbin of scientific history where it belongs, and let's start our journey through deep time, searching for the real origins of human violence, because the truth, as always, is more complicated and more fascinating than the myth. The question isn't whether we're naturally violent. The question is, when did violence become organised, systematic, something more than individual aggression? When did murder become war? Let's go back. Way back. 500,000 years ago. Before modern humans even existed. Before Neanderthals had fully emerged. Back to a time when our ancestors were something else entirely. Homo heidelbergensis. The ancestor species from which both we and Neanderthals would eventually evolve. Picture their world. Not the crowded, competitive landscape we might imagine, but something almost unimaginably empty. The entire human population of Earth, maybe 100,000 individuals total, spread across 3 continents, Africa, Europe, and parts of Western Asia. That's fewer people than currently live in a mid-sized city, distributed across millions of square miles. You could walk for weeks, maybe months, without encountering another human being. The landscape stretched out empty in every direction, grasslands teeming with game, forests thick with fruit and edible plants, rivers full of fish, and almost nobody around to compete for any of it. Small bands drifted through this abundance, groups of maybe 15, 20, 30 individuals connected by kinship. They'd camp by a river for a few weeks, exploiting the local resources, fish, shellfish, whatever game wandered close enough. Then they'd move on, following the herds, tracking the ripening of different plant foods through the seasons. Their territories were enormous, not because they needed all that space to survive, but because population density was so low, there was simply no pressure to stay in one place. No reason to defend boundaries, no neighbouring groups to fight over resources. And this is where the question gets interesting. Were these people violent? Did they kill each other? Did they have warfare, feuds, murders? The honest answer is we don't really know, and the reason we don't know is actually kind of profound. There's almost no evidence. Not just limited evidence, but almost nothing at all. For hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, the archaeological record is virtually silent on the question of interpersonal violence. Now, you might think that silence tells us something definitive. Absence of evidence is evidence of absence, right? If they weren't violent, we wouldn't find evidence of violence. Simple, but it's not that simple. Never is when you're dealing with archaeology. Let me show you why. Spain, Atapuerca Mountains, a cave system called Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones. In the 1990s, archaeologists started excavating this site and found something extraordinary. The remains of at least 28 individuals, all Homo heidelbergensis, all dating to around 430,000 years ago. This was already remarkable. Finding multiple individuals from this time period in one location is incredibly rare. But then they looked closer at one particular skull. Cranium 17, they called it, and they found something that made them stop and wonder. 2 penetrating lesions in the frontal bone. 2 holes, basically, in the forehead. Both showing the same pattern of trauma. Both appearing to have been caused by impacts from the same object, striking from different angles. The bone around the wounds showed no signs of healing, suggesting the individual died shortly after receiving the injuries. This wasn't disease. This wasn't an accident with a falling rock. This looked, to some researchers, like the earliest evidence of lethal interpersonal violence in the human fossil record. Someone, they argued, had struck this person twice in the head with a hand axe or similar stone tool. Murder, 430,000 years ago. But here's where it gets complicated. Other researchers looked at the same skull and saw something different. Maybe it wasn't violence at all, they suggested. Maybe it was an accident. This individual could have fallen, struck their head on a sharp rock, fallen again, struck the same rock from a different angle. Or maybe this was post-mortem damage, something that happened after death, not the cause of it. Still others propose something even stranger. What if this was ritual? What if these wounds were deliberately inflicted after death as part of some burial practice we can't even begin to understand? The truth is, we don't know. We can't know. Looking at bones separated from their context by 430,000 years, we're left guessing, educated guessing, informed by everything we know about trauma patterns and bone healing and archaeological context, but guessing nonetheless. And this is the fundamental problem with trying to understand violence in deep human prehistory. The evidence is ambiguous at best, non-existent at worst. But let's think about the ecological context for a moment, because that might tell us more than the bones ever could. Those small bands of Homo heidelbergensis weren't living in a world that would seem to require violence. Population density was incredibly low. Resources were, by all evidence, relatively abundant. The archaeological sites we find from this period show a consistent pattern. Camps near water sources, evidence of successful hunting, fish and plant resources, tools that are sophisticated enough to indicate effective exploitation of the environment, but not so specialized that they suggest intense competition for specific resources. Think about what creates violence between human groups. Territory, usually. One group has something another group wants. Land, water, food, mates. But when population density is measured in individuals per 1,000 square miles rather than individuals per square mile, when you can walk for weeks without encountering another band, when game is abundant and edible plants are everywhere, what exactly are you fighting over? The calculus of violence changes dramatically when there's nothing worth fighting for. Some researchers have started talking about what they call the deep peace hypothesis. The idea that for most of human prehistory, for hundreds of thousands of years, we simply weren't very violent. not because we were especially peaceful or morally enlightened, but because the conditions that make violence advantageous just didn't exist. Violence is risky. Even if you win a fight, you might get injured. Infections from wounds could kill you. The person you're fighting might have relatives who will retaliate. In small populations where everyone is connected through complex kinship networks, killing someone from another band might mean killing your cousin's mate's brother. The social costs could be catastrophic. So maybe our ancestors avoided violence not out of noble principles, but out of pragmatic calculation. The benefits rarely outweighed the costs. Better to just move away from potential conflicts. Better to maintain those kinship networks and trade relationships that connected distant bands. Better to solve problems through negotiation and reputation management than through bloodshed. But here's what makes this so frustrating for researchers. We're arguing from silence. The absence of evidence for violence doesn't prove people weren't violent. It just means that if they were violent, they didn't leave evidence we can recognize, or that evidence didn't preserve. Bones are fragile. They decay, get scattered by scavengers, crushed by geological processes. Finding any human remains from this period is extraordinary. Finding remains that preserve clear evidence of violence is almost impossibly rare. And violence doesn't always leave marks on bones. Strangulation doesn't. Most soft tissue injuries don't. If someone was speared through the abdomen, stabbed in the chest, had their throat cut, we'd never know from looking at their skeleton thousands of years later. The archaeological record is biased towards certain types of evidence. Blunt force trauma to the skull might preserve. Cuts to bones from stone tools might preserve. But most violence, it vanishes without a trace. So we're left in this strange position, looking at hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, finding almost no clear evidence of violence, but unable to say definitively whether that's because violence didn't happen or because it just didn't preserve. Some researchers lean toward the deep peace hypothesis. Others remain skeptical, arguing that violence is so deeply woven into the behavior of our closest primate relatives that it must have been present in our ancestors too. The Cima de los Huesos skull sits in the middle of this debate. Maybe the earliest evidence of murder, maybe nothing of the sort. A Rorschach test in bone, where what you see depends largely on what you believe about human nature. But whatever violence did or didn't exist 500,000 years ago, one thing seems clear. It wasn't systematic. It wasn't organized. It wasn't warfare. Those small bands drifting through empty landscapes weren't forming alliances to raid their neighbors. They weren't building fortifications or developing specialized weapons. They were just trying to survive, to find food, to raise children in a world that was vast and dangerous and mostly empty of other humans. The shadows of this period are deep. The evidence is fragmentary, and the questions outnumber the answers by orders of magnitude. But that ambiguity is itself telling us something. If violence had been constant, prevalent, a daily fact of life, we'd expect to see more evidence. Not just one controversial skull from Spain, but dozens, hundreds of examples from sites across 3 continents. The near absence of such evidence suggests that whatever else was happening in early human societies, mass violence wasn't defining their existence. Not yet. The Neanderthals were us, but not quite us. For 400,000 years they lived, hunted, loved, and died across Europe and Western Asia. They were a parallel human experiment, an alternative answer to the question of what it means to be human. And if we want to understand when humans started killing each other, we have to look carefully at our closest relatives, because what happened to them, what they did to each other, might tell us something fundamental about our own capacity for violence. First, let's be clear about who they were. Not the brutish cavemen of Victorian imagination, not simple-minded primitives. Neanderthals had brains larger than ours. They made sophisticated tools. They controlled fire, built shelters, created art. They survived multiple ice ages in environments that would kill modern humans in hours. They buried their dead with what looks suspiciously like ritual. They cared for their injured and sick, sometimes for years. We know this because of places like Shanidar Cave, northern Iraq, 1957. Archaeologist Ralph Selecki is excavating a cave in the Zagros Mountains when his team uncovers something extraordinary, a Neanderthal skeleton, but not just any skeleton. This individual, later called Shanidar I, had lived a hard life. His right arm was withered, probably from birth or early injury, essentially useless. His right foot was damaged. Analysis of his skull suggests he was probably blind in one eye. He had also suffered a crushing blow to the left side of his head at some point that had partially healed but left him likely deaf on that side. Here's what makes this remarkable. He lived to be somewhere between 40 and 50 years old. Ancient for a Neanderthal. Ancient for someone with these disabilities. Someone who couldn't hunt effectively, couldn't defend himself properly, couldn't contribute to the group's survival in traditional ways. Yet his injuries show years of healing. He didn't die from them. He lived with them. This means someone took care of him. For years, probably decades, his group fed him, protected him, moved him when they migrated to follow game and seasonal resources. They kept him alive when natural selection should have killed him quickly. That's not the behavior of mindless brutes. That's compassion. That's culture. That's something that looks remarkably like human morality. Then there was Shanidar IV, the famous flower burial. This individual was found in a grave with apparent concentrations of pollen from multiple species of flowers. Selecki interpreted this as evidence of a deliberate burial ceremony, Neanderthals laying their dead to rest on beds of flowers. The romantic image captured imaginations worldwide. Here was proof that Neanderthals felt grief, practiced ritual, contemplated death with the same mixture of sorrow and ceremony that we do. Now there's debate about the flower burial. Some researchers think the pollen might have been introduced by burrowing rodents or natural processes. But even if we set aside the flowers, the intentional burial remains. Neanderthals were placing their dead in graves, not just abandoning bodies where they fell. That suggests symbolic thinking, awareness of death as something meaningful, perhaps even belief in something beyond the physical world. So we have evidence of compassion, care for the vulnerable, ritual treatment of the dead. This paints a picture of peaceful, cooperative societies, Neanderthals as gentle souls living in harmony with their harsh environment. Except that's not the whole picture. Because when you look closer at Neanderthal skeletons, you start seeing something else. Patterns of injury that look disturbingly familiar. Healed fractures on skulls, broken ribs, damaged vertebrae. Individual injuries might be accidents. Everyone falls sometimes. Everyone has a hunting mishap. But when you analyze the patterns statistically across multiple individuals and sites, something troubling emerges. The distribution of Neanderthal injuries matches modern patterns of interpersonal violence remarkably closely. Head and neck trauma show up with suspicious frequency. The types of fractures, their locations, the angles of impact, they're consistent with being hit by another person, rather than falling or being attacked by animals. Some researchers have compared the Neanderthal injury patterns to modern rodeo riders, people who regularly get thrown from large animals. The similarity is striking, which initially suggested Neanderthals were just experiencing hunting accidents, while tackling dangerous prey up close with thrusting spears. But other researchers noticed something else. When you separate male and female skeletons, the injury patterns diverge in ways that don't match the rodeo hypothesis. Males show more cranial trauma, more injuries consistent with face-to-face confrontation. Females show different patterns, more arm and rib fractures, defensive injuries. This looks less like hunting accidents and more like violence within communities, domestic abuse perhaps, or conflicts over resources and status. Then there's the Saint-Césaire Neanderthal, found in France, dated to about 36,000 years ago, right near the end of the Neanderthal timeline. This individual had a partially healed wound on the top of the skull, not from a fall, not from an animal attack. The shape and depth suggest a blade, a sharp stone tool deliberately driven into the skull with force. The wound had started healing, meaning this person survived the initial attack, living days or weeks before eventually dying. Was this murder, an execution, combat between rival groups? We don't know. We can't know. But we know someone struck another human relative with a weapon designed to kill, and that weapon left its mark in fossil bone for us to find 36,000 years later. The evidence gets more complicated when we consider Neanderthal interactions with modern humans. Around 50,000 years ago, our ancestors began moving into Neanderthal territories in Europe and the Middle East. For thousands of years, the two species overlapped geographically. We know they encountered each other. We know they sometimes interbred. Genetic analysis shows that most modern humans outside Africa carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, evidence of ancient mixing. But what was the nature of those encounters? Peaceful coexistence? Trading partners who occasionally married across species lines? Or something darker? Violent competition for caves, hunting grounds, water sources, raids, ambushes, territorial warfare? Some archaeological sites show modern humans and Neanderthals living in the same regions but using different resources, suggesting they carved out separate ecological niches to avoid direct competition. Others show what looks like rapid replacement, Neanderthals disappearing from areas within centuries of modern human arrival. Was that competition, disease, violence, or just demographic bad luck? There are hints of violence. A few Neanderthal remains from the period of overlap show injuries consistent with weapons used by modern humans. A few early modern human remains show injuries that might come from Neanderthal weapons, but the evidence is fragmentary, disputed, impossible to interpret with certainty. What we do know is that by 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations were declining rapidly. By 30,000 years ago, they were gone. After 400,000 years of successful adaptation to Ice Age Europe, they vanished within a few millennia of our arrival. That timing is suspicious, maybe coincidental, but suspicious. Did we kill them off? Hunt them systematically, drive them from their territories, eliminate competition for resources through violence? Some researchers think so. They point to the rapid disappearance, the lack of Neanderthal sites after modern human arrival, the occasional evidence of violent trauma as proof that we committed the first genocide, wiping out our closest relatives through systematic warfare. Others argue the truth is more complex. Climate change was making things difficult. Neanderthal populations were small and isolated, vulnerable to genetic problems from inbreeding. Diseases carried by modern humans might have devastated populations with no immunity. And there was that interbreeding, which means some Neanderthals weren't killed. They were absorbed, their genes living on in mixed populations. Maybe it was all of these factors: competition that sometimes turned violent, disease that weakened populations, climate stress that made resources scarce and groups desperate, interbreeding that blurred species boundaries. The death of Neanderthals might have been murder, or it might have been assimilation, or it might have been just the tragic luck of being a small population at the wrong place, in the wrong time when a more numerous, slightly more adaptable competitor showed up. But here's what haunts researchers who study this period. The violence we see in Neanderthal remains isn't just at the boundary with modern humans. It goes back hundreds of thousands of years. Those healed fractures, those patterns of trauma, they appear throughout Neanderthal history. Which means if Neanderthals were violent toward each other, that violence predates their contact with us. It was already part of their world. And if our closest relatives, the species most similar to us, were capable of hurting each other, killing each other, what does that say about the human capacity for violence? Was it inevitable? Something hardwired into any intelligent social species competing for limited resources? Or was it a choice, a cultural pattern that could have been different? The Neanderthal question doesn't give us easy answers. It gives us broken bones that might be accidents or might be murder. It gives us evidence of compassion alongside evidence of violence. It gives us a mirror that reflects something uncomfortable about ourselves. We are the descendants of the species that survived. They are the ones who didn't, and somewhere in that difference might lie a truth about violence that we're not ready to face. Something extraordinary was happening inside the human skull. Between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, our ancestors underwent what anthropologists call the cognitive revolution, a fundamental transformation in how the human mind worked. Not a biological change, not a sudden mutation, but something more subtle and infinitely more powerful. The brain that evolution had built during the bottleneck was finally learning how to use itself. The archaeological evidence appears gradually, scattered across sites in Africa and the Middle East. Pieces of ochre with abstract patterns carved into them, seashells with deliberate holes drilled through them, clearly meant to be strung as beads, stone tools that show evidence of design standardization, not just functional implements but objects made according to mental templates, cave walls bearing the first tentative marks that would eventually become art. These weren't just artifacts. They were evidence of minds that could think about things that didn't exist yet, minds that could plan for tomorrow, next week, next year, minds that could create symbols, attach meanings to objects and sounds and gestures, minds that could imagine, and minds that could imagine were minds that could conceive of us and them, friend and enemy, justice and revenge. The transformation wasn't sudden. You couldn't point to a specific generation and say, this is when humans became modern. It was more like a slow awakening, spreading through populations over thousands of years. Some groups developed these capabilities earlier than others. Some innovations emerged independently in multiple places. Others spread through cultural contact and imitation. But by 50,000 years ago, the process was essentially complete. Humans had acquired the full cognitive toolkit that would allow them to eventually dominate the planet. The question is, what did this revolution mean for violence? Did it make us more peaceful, better able to cooperate and resolve conflicts through communication? Or did it give us new and more terrifying ways to kill each other? The uncomfortable answer is probably both. Let's start with the cooperation side because it's easier to document and more pleasant to contemplate. The cognitive revolution enabled humans to work together in unprecedented ways. Complex language, which was almost certainly fully developed by this period, allowed detailed information sharing. You could explain to someone exactly where to find water during a drought, or how to process a particular plant to make it edible, or which animals were dangerous and which were safe to approach. You could teach complicated skills through verbal instruction, rather than just demonstration and imitation. More importantly, you could create social bonds through storytelling. You could share memories of ancestors, creating a sense of continuity across generations. You could establish group identity through shared myths and origin stories. You could negotiate marriages and alliances by discussing abstract concepts like family obligations and reciprocal duties. The social brain hypothesis suggests this is exactly what human cognition evolved for. Our brains didn't get so large because we needed to solve mathematical problems or invent complex technologies. They got large because we needed to navigate increasingly complex social environments. By 100,000 years ago, human groups were getting bigger. The archaeological evidence shows campsites that could accommodate 50, 60, maybe even 100 individuals. That's far more than the small bands of 20 or 30 that had been typical during the bottleneck period. Managing relationships in groups that size requires serious cognitive horsepower. You need to remember who's related to whom, who owes favours to whom, who can be trusted and who needs watching. You need to form coalitions, navigate status hierarchies, manage conflicts without letting them tear the group apart. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers have found that people in these societies spend enormous amounts of time gossiping, sharing information about each other's behaviour, building and maintaining reputations. The cognitive revolution gave humans the mental tools to play these social games at scale. But here's the darker implication. Every tool that helps you cooperate more effectively with your own group can also help you compete more effectively against other groups. Complex language that lets you coordinate a hunting strategy can also let you coordinate an ambush. Symbolic thinking that creates strong group identity through shared stories and rituals also creates clear boundaries between insiders and outsiders. Abstract reasoning that allows you to plan for future contingencies can just as easily be applied to planning attacks on rivals. The evidence for this dark side appears in the archaeological record around the same time as the evidence for behavioural modernity. At Herto in Ethiopia, 3 skulls dated to around 160,000 years ago show something disturbing. They've been deliberately modified after death, defleshed using stone tools. The pattern of cut marks suggests careful, systematic removal of soft tissue. This wasn't butchery for food. The cuts are in the wrong places, and there's no evidence of nutritional cannibalism. Instead, it looks like some kind of mortuary practice, possibly related to ancestor veneration. Now that might sound relatively benign, but think about what it implies. These people were engaging in complex post-mortem rituals that required symbolic thinking. They were treating dead bodies as meaningful objects, not just meat, and at least one of the Herto skulls shows evidence of violent trauma before death. A crushing blow to the head, possibly from a club or stone. We can't know for certain whether this was murder or accident, execution or casualty of conflict, but combined with the defleshing practices, it suggests these early modern humans had developed complex relationships with death, violence, and group identity. Other sites tell similar stories. At Clayse's River mouth in South Africa, deposits from around 90,000 years ago contain butchered human remains mixed with animal bones. Again, the context suggests something more complicated than simple cannibalism. These might have been enemies killed and desecrated, or members of the group who died and were consumed in mortuary rituals, or victims of some catastrophe whose bodies were processed for survival. We can't be sure. But what's clear is that human bodies were being treated differently than they had been in earlier periods. They were becoming symbolic objects laden with meaning. The development of projectile technology during this period added a new dimension to the potential for violence. Earlier humans had used thrusting spears, weapons that required close contact with prey or enemies. But around 70,000 years ago, evidence appears for atlatls, spear throwers that used leverage to hurl projectiles much farther and with much greater force than hand-thrown spears. This is sophisticated technology. You need to understand abstract concepts like angle, velocity, and trajectory. You need materials that are strong enough to withstand repeated use. You need practice and training to develop accuracy. But once you master it, you can kill from a distance. You can hide behind cover and strike targets 50-60 yards away. You can hunt more effectively, taking down dangerous game without risking close combat. And you can also attack human enemies with much less personal risk. Before projectile weapons, violence was inherently risky. Even if you were bigger and stronger than your opponent, close combat meant you might get hurt or killed. This created natural constraints on aggression. Most confrontations between individuals or small groups probably ended with threats, displays, maybe some minor injuries, but not systematic slaughter. Projectile weapons change that calculus. Now you could initiate violence while remaining relatively safe yourself. You could attack by surprise from concealment. You could target specific individuals from distances they couldn't effectively respond to. The archaeological record shows steady improvement in projectile technology throughout this period. Spear points become lighter, more aerodynamic, clearly designed for throwing rather than thrusting. By 40,000 years ago, some populations had developed specialized throwing sticks and possibly even early bows and arrows. Were these weapons developed for hunting, or for warfare, or both? Almost certainly both. The same technology that lets you take down an antelope from 60 yards also lets you kill a human from the same distance. And once one group had developed projectile weapons, their neighbors would have faced intense pressure to develop them too, or find themselves at a potentially fatal disadvantage. But perhaps the most profound change wasn't technological at all. It was ideological. The cognitive revolution gave humans the ability to think abstractly about group membership. Before symbolic thinking, your social world was probably defined by direct personal relationships. You knew the people in your band. You recognized their faces and voices. You had individual relationships with each of them. Groups probably competed for resources, but it was personal. You were competing against specific individuals you could see and interact with. Symbolic thinking changed that. Now you could conceive of abstract categories: your people versus other people, your tribe versus their tribe, members versus outsiders. These categories didn't require direct personal knowledge. You could identify someone as belonging to another group based on how they dressed, how they spoke, what symbols they displayed. And once you could categorize people this way, you could develop group-level attitudes toward them. You could see them as fundamentally different, perhaps less than fully human. You could develop origin myths that explained why your group was special and other groups were inferior or dangerous. Modern hunter-gatherer societies show us how this works. Most have clear concepts of group boundaries. They have names for themselves that usually translate as something like the people or the true humans, implicitly categorizing outsiders as not quite fully people. They have strict rules about sharing food and resources within the group, but no such obligations toward outsiders. They tell stories about conflicts with neighboring groups, building historical narratives of grievance and revenge that can persist for generations. This is the dark side of the social brain. The same cognitive tools that allow large-scale cooperation within groups also facilitate large-scale conflict between groups. Symbolic thinking that creates strong in-group bonds through shared identity also creates rigid out-group boundaries. Abstract reasoning that allows future planning can be applied to planning coordinated violence. Complex language that permits detailed coordination of cooperative activities also permits detailed coordination of attacks. By 50,000 years ago, humans had become something unprecedented in evolutionary history. A species capable of cooperation on scales that dwarfed anything seen in other primates, but also capable of conceptualizing other humans as enemies, deserving of systematic violence. A species that could plan, coordinate, and execute collective aggression, using technologies specifically designed to kill at a distance. The archaeological evidence from this period doesn't show clear proof of warfare. Not yet. There are no mass graves, no fortifications, no specialized weapons that could only be used against humans. But the cognitive and technological foundations were in place. Humans now had minds capable of imagining organized violence. They had languages capable of coordinating it. They had technologies capable of executing it. They had symbolic systems capable of justifying it. All the pieces were assembled. They just hadn't been put together yet in a systematic way. That would come later, when human populations began expanding out of Africa and encountering each other in territories where resources were limited and stakes were high. When modern humans met Neanderthals and Denisovans, when different populations of modern humans competed for the same hunting grounds and water sources, the cognitive revolution would reveal its full destructive potential. But for now, in Africa between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, humans were still learning what it meant to have minds like these, still discovering the possibilities and dangers of consciousness that could imagine what didn't exist, plan for what hadn't happened yet, and conceive of other humans as something other than individual people with individual relationships, but as categories, groups, enemies. The revolution was complete, the new human mind was fully formed, and the world would never be the same. The world was changing again. Around 70,000 years ago, the climate that had been relatively stable for millennia started shifting. Not another catastrophic bottleneck, but something almost as challenging: unpredictability. Monsoon patterns that African populations had relied on for generations began failing. Lakes that had been permanent fixtures started shrinking. And the descendants of those bottleneck survivors, now fully modern humans with brains wired for problem-solving and innovation, faced a choice: adapt in place or move. Some stayed, but others looked north, toward the narrow strip of land connecting Africa to the rest of the world. The Sinai Peninsula and the Levantine Corridor, that thin bridge between continents where three land masses almost touch. During certain periods when sea levels dropped, this became an open highway. During others it narrowed to a choke point barely 20 miles wide. Either way, it was the doorway to everywhere else. But here's the thing, that doorway wasn't empty. Neanderthals had been living in the Levant for over 100,000 years. They knew every water source, every cave, every seasonal migration route of the animals they hunted. This was their territory, refined and defended across thousands of generations. And now, for the first time in perhaps 200,000 years, the two species were about to meet again. The first encounters probably weren't violent. Picture small groups of modern humans moving cautiously through unfamiliar terrain, following coastlines, staying near water sources. They would have seen evidence of other humans everywhere: stone tools, butchered animal remains, the smoke of distant fires. And the Neanderthals would have seen them too. Strange people who looked almost right but not quite. Lighter builds, different faces, tools made with slightly different techniques. What happened next is one of the most debated questions in human evolution. Did they fight? Did they trade? Did they mate? The answer, frustratingly and fascinatingly, seems to be all of the above. The genetic evidence tells us that modern humans and Neanderthals definitely interbred. Everyone alive today who has ancestry outside of Africa carries Neanderthal DNA, typically around 2%. This mixing happened somewhere in the Middle East, probably in that Levantine corridor between 60,000 and 50,000 years ago. But here's what's strange. The interbreeding appears limited. Not the pattern you'd expect from two populations living peacefully side by side for thousands of years. More like occasional encounters, brief overlaps in territory, maybe even forced reproductive encounters during conflicts. The archaeological record gives us snapshots, frustratingly incomplete, of what this contact zone looked like. In the Levant we find something peculiar. Alternating layers of Neanderthal and modern human artifacts. For periods of thousands of years, Neanderthals dominate the archaeological record. Then suddenly the tools change style, modern human artifacts appear. Then just as suddenly, Neanderthal-style tools return. This back and forth happens multiple times over tens of thousands of years. Population replacement. That's what archaeologists call it, though the term doesn't capture the human drama it represents. One group arrives, establishes themselves, thrives for a while. Then something happens. Climate shift, disease, conflict, or maybe just bad luck. The population collapses or retreats. The territory empties. Then the other group moves back in. It's like two boxers trading rounds, except the rounds last 5,000 years and the prize is survival itself. The Manuk Cave in Israel gives us one of the clearest glimpses into this world. In 2015, archaeologists discovered a partial skull dated to around 55,000 years ago. Definitely modern human, but found in a region where Neanderthals had lived for millennia and would continue living for thousands of years more. The cave also contained tools from multiple periods, some clearly Neanderthal, others ambiguous, possibly showing technological exchange. This is the signature of a contact zone. Not a clear boundary with one species on each side, but a fuzzy frontier where populations mixed, fought, separated, and mixed again. Where individuals from both species might have lived entire lifetimes without meeting, or might have encountered each other regularly depending on the decade, the season, the luck of migration patterns. But the Levant was just the beginning. Once modern humans pushed through that corridor, they exploded across the world faster than any mammal species in history. Within 20,000 years, humans had reached Australia, Siberia, and were standing on the edge of the Americas. This wasn't gradual diffusion. This was rapid, almost aggressive expansion into every available ecological niche. The journey to Australia is particularly revealing. Around 50,000 years ago, possibly earlier, modern humans arrived in what's now called Sahul, the supercontinent that connected Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania during the Ice Age. Even with lower sea levels, reaching Australia required crossing at least 50 miles of open ocean. Not a casual fishing trip that drifted off course. Deliberate maritime technology, planning and courage. These people weren't running from something. They were running toward possibility. New territories, new resources, new opportunities. But Australia wasn't empty. It was filled with megafauna. Giant kangaroos standing 10 feet tall, marsupial lions, enormous lizards that would have made modern crocodiles look small. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, 85% of these megafauna species were extinct. Coincidence? Maybe. Climate change certainly played a role. Australia was drying out, becoming more seasonal. But the timing is suspicious. Megafauna had survived previous climate shifts. They hadn't survived sustained human hunting pressure, combined with landscape modification through fire. The archaeological evidence suggests humans systematically burned vast areas, changing the vegetation patterns, disrupting the ecosystems these giant animals depended on. This wasn't warfare in any conventional sense, but it was competition. The kind of existential competition where one species' expansion means another species' extinction. The megafauna didn't declare war on humans. They simply couldn't adapt fast enough to survive human presence. And here's where the story gets darker. Some researchers have suggested there might have been earlier human populations in Australia, perhaps Homo erectus descendants, who had arrived hundreds of thousands of years earlier. The evidence is contested, mostly consisting of controversial tool finds and disputed dating. But if there were earlier humans, they left no genetic trace in modern populations. No DNA, no clear archaeological continuity. Just silence. Either they never existed, or they disappeared completely when modern humans arrived. Replaced so thoroughly that not even their genes survived. Back in Eurasia, the same drama was playing out on a larger scale. Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans controlled much of Eastern and Central Asia. And modern humans were pushing into both territories, following rivers, coastlines, and animal migrations. Every encounter was a test. Who had better weapons, better social organization, better resistance to diseases, better luck? The genetic data shows multiple episodes of interbreeding. Modern humans mated with Neanderthals in the Middle East. Later, Different modern human groups encountered Denisovans in Asia and interbred again. Some populations even carry DNA from a third, still unidentified hominin species, ghost populations that left no fossils but survive as traces in our genes. These encounters weren't always hostile. DNA doesn't transfer through violence alone. There had to be periods of coexistence, however brief, where individuals from different species live close enough to form relationships, have children, integrate genes, maybe even share knowledge, trade goods, tell stories across the species barrier. But the overall pattern is unmistakable. Wherever modern humans went, other human species eventually disappeared. Not immediately. The process took thousands of years in most places, but the trend was consistent. We arrived, we interbred, we competed, and eventually we were the only ones left. What gave modern humans the edge? We weren't physically stronger than Neanderthals. We didn't have bigger brains than Denisovans. But we had something else. Better social networks, maybe. The ability to maintain cooperation in larger groups. More flexible technology that could adapt quickly to new environments. Possibly better throwing weapons, allowing us to hunt and fight from safer distances. Or maybe we were just slightly better at violence. More systematic, more organized, more willing to wage coordinated campaigns against competitors. The evidence for direct conflict is still sparse, but the pattern of replacement suggests something more than peaceful coexistence. By 40,000 years ago, the situation was clear. Modern humans had established themselves across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Australia. Neanderthals still controlled Europe, but were being pushed into increasingly marginal territories. Denisovans were retreating to isolated pockets in Central Asia. The competition wasn't over, but the outcome was becoming predictable. The crossroads had been crossed, and humanity, our branch of humanity, had chosen its path, forward, always forward, into new territories regardless of who was already there. What happened at those crossroads would determine not just which species survived, but what kind of species we would become. Every encounter taught us something about competition, about resource control, about what it takes to survive when multiple intelligent species want the same land. We learned those lessons well, perhaps too well. By the time we reach the Mesolithic, the long shadow of Ice Age Europe is finally retreating. The glaciers are melting, sea levels are rising, forests creep northward, inch by inch, year by year. Animals shift their ranges, rivers cut new channels, lakes appear where there had only been bare rock and ice. From a distance it sounds like a gentle thawing, a world softening, becoming more hospitable. Up close, for the people actually living through it, it was chaos. Old hunting grounds vanished underwater. Herds that had once migrated in reliable patterns began wandering unpredictably. Coastlines flooded, islands formed. Strips of land that had once connected whole regions were swallowed by the sea, and there, at the edge of this changing world, we begin to see something we had only been able to hint at before. Not just broken bones that might be accidents, not just a few suspicious skull fractures we can debate endlessly. Clear, unmistakable evidence of people killing each other. Not once, not in a single freak event, but repeatedly, across centuries, across continents. The Mesolithic is where the fog finally lifts. The first and most haunting window into this new world of human violence comes from a quiet stretch of the Nile Valley, near the modern border of Sudan and Egypt, a place called Jebel Sahaba. If you could stand there 13,000 years ago, it wouldn't feel like a battlefield. No banners, no yelling warriors in armor, no fortified walls, just a river moving steadily through a dry land as it had for millions of years. But the Nile, in that moment of history, was more than a river. It was a lifeline. Climate records tell us that around this time North Africa was lurching between wetter and drier phases, Grasslands that had once stretched out like endless green carpets were shrinking. Rainfall became erratic, lakes dried up, herds thinned out. As the surrounding lands grew harsher, the Nile Valley became a narrow ribbon of relative abundance. Fish, waterfowl, hippos, Nile perch, edible plants along the banks. Enough resources to support larger, more stable human groups. But there was a catch. You can't stretch a river. As more people crowded toward this dependable water source, the carrying capacity of the valley was pushed to its limits. Groups that might once have roamed widely over the savannah were now pressed together along a corridor only a few kilometers wide. More people, less land, fluctuating resources. It's under these conditions that the cemetery at Jebel Sahaba was created. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of at least 61 individuals buried there. Men, women, children. Not a war band, a community. And when they looked closely at the bones, the story they told was not peaceful. Many of the skeletons show clear evidence of violent death, not vague stress marks, not ambiguous cracks that might be from a fall. Stone projectile points embedded in bones, tiny flint flakes lodged in vertebrae, in pelvises, in skulls. At least 45% of the individuals had healed or unhealed injuries from projectiles. Some had multiple wounds. Some had both healed and fresh ones, meaning they had survived earlier attacks only to be struck again later. This was not one raid, not one terrible day. This was a pattern. Imagine one of these people, a woman in her 20s. Her skeleton shows an arm bone pierced by a flint-tipped arrow that healed years before her death. Her pelvis bears tiny stone fragments from another impact. Her ribs show a newer penetration that never healed. She had lived through violence more than once. She had carried those scars while gathering food, raising children, moving along the riverbank. She'd survived earlier encounters, until the last one, and it wasn't just adults. Children's bones at Jebel Sahaba also show projectile wounds. Some died with flint points still lodged in their bodies. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't ritual combat between warriors under agreed rules. It was something far colder. Entire groups targeting entire groups. Why? The geology and ecology give us some clues. Around the time this cemetery was in use, the Nile's flow was changing. Shifts in monsoon patterns were altering flood intensity. Some years would have been abundant, others meagre. A bad flood or failed inundation could mean hunger. In that world, a rich fishing spot, a fertile patch of floodplain, a strategic bend in the river. Those weren't just conveniences, they were survival itself. Now picture multiple foraging groups, all pressed into the same valley, all needing access to the same key zones at the same times of year. Each group with its own kin ties, its own children to feed. Territory stops being a vague idea and becomes a hard line. Here is where we fish. Here is where we set our traps. Here is where we camp. Step over that line at the wrong moment and arrows fly. The cemetery at Jebel Sahaba preserves the casualties of this pressure cooker. Some bodies bear dozens of tiny flint flakes, fragments from what were likely volleys of arrows or thrown spears tipped with microliths. Others show evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, suggesting close combat followed the initial barrage. This is why some archaeologists refer to it, cautiously, as the earliest known battlefield. Not because we have marching armies and organized generals, but because for the first time we see a whole community repeatedly subjected to lethal attacks from other humans, probably over years or generations. The killing isn't hypothetical anymore. It's written directly into the bones, and Jebel Sahaba is not alone. If we travel south along the African Rift and fast forward a few thousand years, we arrive at another lakeside place, one that would become just as infamous in the debate about the origins of war. Nataruk in western Kenya. 10,000 years ago, this was the edge of a shallow lake, a place where small groups of hunter-gatherers could exploit fish, shellfish, waterfowl, and the animals that came to drink. A rich, attractive niche. The people who lived there left no villages, no permanent stone houses, no formal cemeteries. When the remains were first found, they weren't in orderly graves. They were where they fell. Archaeologists eventually documented at least 27 individuals at Nataruk. Of those, 12 show clear evidence of violent death. Again, not ambiguous damage, not just one suspicious fracture. We see crushed skulls, broken knees, sharp cuts to bones made by stone blades, projectiles lodged in the head and torso. One of the most haunting skeletons is that of a woman late in pregnancy. Her hands and feet show positions consistent with having been bound when she died. There was no careful burial, no grave goods. She was left face down in the mud and eventually covered by lake sediments. Nearby, a man with a stone projectile point still stuck in his skull. Another with severe knee injuries that would have made escape impossible. Children among the dead, some killed by massive blunt force trauma. Unlike Jebel Sahaba, where we see repeated violence recorded in a formal burial ground, Nataruk looks like a snapshot, a single event, a massacre. There are clues that this wasn't just random murder. The people at Nataruk seem to have possessed valuable items, pottery fragments, stone tools made from non-local materials, perhaps evidence of stored resources like fish or dried meat. In a world of mobile hunter-gatherers, a lakeshore camp with stored food and useful tools would be a tempting target. Imagine arriving at dawn. Another group is encamped at the shoreline, their hearths still smouldering, fish racks drying under the rising sun. Maybe recent arguments over access to this lake had already soured relations. Maybe these groups had clashed before. This time the attackers don't shout warnings or negotiate. They close in, weapons ready. Some victims are struck as they flee, others are bound. People are killed where they stand, where they sit, where they kneel. There's no sign that the dead at Nataruk were buried by their own people. Their bodies remained where they fell, slowly sinking into the wet ground, sealed by the sediments of the shrinking lake. Here, again, we're forced to reckon with something we can no longer explain away as a rare anomaly. Different region, different environment, different culture, same pattern. Violence emerging where three forces intersect: climate stress, resource concentration, and increasing population density. At Jebel Sahaba, the Nile became a narrow artery of life in a drying land. At Nataruk, a lake in a semi-arid landscape concentrated resources seasonally into a small, highly desirable zone. Both times the result was deadly. And this isn't just an African story. While these dramas were unfolding along rivers and lakes, Mesolithic groups in Europe were also adapting to a rapidly changing post-glacial world. The giant ice sheets that had once covered Scandinavia and much of northern Europe were retreating. As they melted, they created an intricate patchwork of lakes, rivers, coastal inlets, and new shorelines. Mesolithic Europeans were specialists at exploiting these watery environments. They fished, gathered shellfish, hunted forest game, and moved seasonally between rich resource patches. But as the climate stabilized into the Holocene and the forests thickened, something else was happening in the background. Human numbers rose. We see this in the sheer explosion of Mesolithic sites. Coastal shell middens, riverside camps, lakeshore settlements. More people. More permanent or semi-permanent usage of key locations. More investment in particular territories. And as that happened, the archaeology starts to whisper the same familiar story. At some European Mesolithic cemeteries, a noticeable fraction of skeletons bear signs of violent trauma. At the site of Offnet in Germany, 2 pit burials contain decapitated skulls, many of them with lethal injuries, possibly the victims of a raid or ritual killing. At other sites, like Skateholm in Sweden or Teviek and Hoedic in France, some individuals show arrow wounds, smashed skulls, broken arms likely used to ward off blows. These are not universal patterns. Many people show no sign of violence at all, but they are frequent enough and geographically widespread enough to suggest that interpersonal killing was not rare. In Denmark and southern Scandinavia, where the rising sea flooded low-lying areas and turned old hunting grounds into underwater landscapes, conflict may have flared around the newly valuable coasts and estuaries. Some bog bodies and scattered bones hint at executions, ambushes, or ritual killings. Once again, the same combination appears: shifting environments, concentrated resources along coasts, rivers, and lakes, growing populations investing in specific territories, and threaded through that tapestry traces of blood. None of this means that Mesolithic life was one constant war. The majority of skeletal remains from this period do not show evidence of violent death. Most people died of disease, accidents, or slow aging, just as in most pre-industrial societies. But compared to the long, murky record before 15,000 BC, something has changed. For the first time, we can clearly trace multiple episodes of organized, lethal group violence across different regions at roughly the same broad time window. At Jebel Sahaba, we see a community enduring repeated attacks along a contested river. At Nataruk, we see a sudden massacre on a lakeshore, complete with bound captives and pregnant victims. In Mesolithic Europe, we see scattered but consistent evidence of raids, executions, and interpersonal killing woven into the fabric of forager life. The pattern that emerges is not of an innately bloodthirsty species doomed to slaughter each other no matter what. It's subtler and in some ways more unsettling, where climate change squeezes resources into narrow corridors, where populations rise and mobility shrinks, where certain places become worth fighting for again and again. Violence starts to crystallize. It stops being occasional personal grudges and begins to look like something more structured, more collective, more strategic. In the Mesolithic, the killing becomes clear, but even here, we are still looking at small-scale societies, bands and tribes, not states, raids and ambushes, not standing armies. The story of organized war, as we recognize it today, is still in the future, and it will begin not on a battlefield, but in a field of grain. Picture another dawn, not the endless wandering dawn of your hunter-gatherer ancestors, not people waking up in a different camp every few weeks, reading the landscape like a book, following herds and seasons. Now the sun is rising over something strange, something utterly new in the long story of our species. Fields, low, regular lines of barley or wheat, beads of dew on blades of grass that didn't just happen to grow there. People put those plants there. They cleared the land, broke the soil, dropped seeds in with their own hands, and instead of shouldering their packs and moving on, they stayed. This is the Neolithic transition, the agricultural revolution. Between about 10,000 and 6,000 BC, in scattered pockets from the Near East to China to Mesoamerica, humans started doing something we had almost never done before. We tied ourselves to one piece of land. From the outside, it doesn't look like the obvious beginning of war. There are no bronze swords yet, no chariots, no kings, just villages of mud brick houses, a few fields, some sheep and goats, clay pots filled with stored grain. But under the surface, something fundamental has shifted. For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors' main defense against disaster was mobility. If a valley dried up, they moved. If game animals migrated, they followed. Land didn't belong to anyone in a permanent way. You might have favourite hunting spots, sacred groves, seasonal fishing sites. But if another group passed through next year, there was room for negotiation, for sharing, for going somewhere else. Agriculture changed the equation. Once you've spent months clearing a field, weeding it, guarding it from animals, you can't just walk away. Once you've stored a year's food in clay jars hidden in a pit under your house, you can't just shrug if someone takes it. For the first time in our history, large numbers of humans had something very specific, very tangible and very visible to lose: surplus, grain that would last past the next week, herds that would grow year by year, olive trees and fig trees that would bear fruit for generations. You can think of it as a new kind of power. Power that is heavy, power that sits in one place, power that can be guarded, stolen, taxed, inherited. And with that came a concept that hunter-gatherers only had in a loose, flexible way: property. Not just my spear or your necklace, but our land, our fields, our water, our village. You don't need to be a philosopher to see where this might go. If food is on the move, spread thinly across the landscape, raiding someone else's supply is time-consuming and dangerous. If food is piled up in granaries inside a wall, the temptation is different. One successful raid could feed your group for months. The agricultural revolution didn't invent human aggression, it reshaped the stakes. But here's where the story becomes more complicated than the simple narrative of farming causes war. Because when we look at the archaeological evidence from the early Neolithic, what we see is not a straight line of escalating violence. We see ambiguity. We see experiments. We see communities trying to solve new problems in very different ways. Take Jericho. Around 8000 BC, long before pyramids or ziggurats, people living near a freshwater spring in the Jordan Valley built something astonishing. A wall, not a few defensive stakes or a simple fence for goats, a massive stone and mud brick wall several meters high, encircling a settlement. Next to it, a round stone tower, about 8 or 9 meters tall, with an internal staircase spiraling up from the base. If you could stand there at the time, in the cool of the early morning, you'd see people moving in and out of the gate, fields stretching away, the tower casting a long shadow. For decades, archaeologists pointed to Jericho's wall as the first clear evidence of war in the Neolithic. Why else build something like that, if not to keep enemies out? But as more careful work was done, doubts crept in. The wall predates many of the clearer signs of organized warfare. There are no obvious mass graves from this period at Jericho, no scenes of battle carved in stone, no layers of burning that clearly mark a siege. Some researchers think the wall's main job might have been something much less dramatic and much more practical: flood protection. The settlement sat near a wadi that could flash flood after heavy rains. A wall and tower could help control erosion, protect houses, and manage water flow. Others think the tower could have been a ritual monument, aligned with the sun or local landmarks, a kind of early architectural statement about community identity. Of course, a wall that stops water will also slow down raiders. A tower that lets you watch the sun will also let you watch who's approaching. So Jericho sits in this ambiguous space. It shows us that early farmers were thinking in terms of boundaries, of inside and outside, of us and them. It suggests they were capable of large-scale collective projects, the kind of cooperation that later would build fortresses, but it doesn't give us an open and shut case of Neolithic warfare. For that, we have to look elsewhere. Travel in your mind a bit further north and west, to the Anatolian plateau, around 7000 to 6000 BC. Here, a very different experiment in settled life was unfolding. Çatalhöyük. If Jericho looks like a walled town, Çatalhöyük looks like a beehive turned inside out. Thousands of people living in a dense cluster of mud brick houses, packed so tightly together that there are no streets. To move around, you climb out through a hole in your roof, walk across the roofs of neighbouring houses, and climb down through their roofs. The outer edges of the settlement form a kind of human wall. housebacks pressed together facing the outside world. Inside, the houses are full of life. Hearths, bins for storing grain, platforms where people slept and buried their dead, walls painted with hunting scenes, leopards, vultures, geometric patterns, figurines of women, bulls' horns set into plaster. If ever there was a place where conflict could explode, too many people, too close together, surrounded by valuable resources, this is it. And yet, when archaeologists comb through the bones from Çatalhöyük, something stands out. Most injuries are accidents, falls, domestic mishaps. There are very few skeletons with weapon wounds, no clear mass graves from massacres, no layers where the whole town is burned in an attack. People did die violently sometimes, humans are humans, but there's little sign of a large-scale warfare. This doesn't mean life was peaceful in some romantic sense. There were tensions, hierarchies, probably arguments over fields, inheritance, status. But for centuries, maybe 1,000 years, this densely packed farming town seems to have managed its conflicts without turning into a battlefield. So, on one side, Jericho, walls and towers, but unclear enemies. On the other side, Çatalhöyük, no obvious fortifications, but a huge and vulnerable population, somehow holding together without constant warfare. If agriculture automatically caused war, you'd expect the evidence to be loud and obvious everywhere. Instead, it's a whisper here and there, growing slowly louder as the millennia pass. And then, around 5000 BC, in what is now Germany, on the banks of a quiet little stream near the village of Talheim, the whisper becomes a scream. Archaeologists found it in 1983, a shallow pit. Inside, the jumbled skeletons of at least 34 people, men, women, children, most of them showing blunt force trauma to the head, injuries to arms that look like defensive wounds, some with arrowheads still lodged in their bones. The bodies weren't buried carefully, they were dumped. This is the Talheim death pit, one of the clearest early Neolithic massacres we know. These people belong to the linear banceramic culture, LBK for short, some of the first farmers to spread across Central Europe. They built longhouses, planted crops, and, increasingly, seem to have clashed with their neighbours. At Talheim, the pattern is brutal. It looks like an entire small community was wiped out, or a group captured during a raid and executed. Some of the skeletons appear to have come from a different group, possibly taken as captives, then killed. Here the ingredients we've been tracing come together starkly. Settled villages, recognizable group identities, land cleared and farmed, surplus stored, and now clear evidence that another group saw them not as trade partners or distant cousins, but as targets. Why did it come to this here, and not at Çatalhöyük? Why did some farming societies slide into cycles of raiding and reprisal, while others seem to have found ways to coexist for centuries? We don't have a single tidy answer. What we have are patterns, possibilities. Agriculture did a few key things that made warfare more likely. It increased population density. More people, living closer together, means more chances for friction. Old feuds that might have been solved by walking away now happened in places you couldn't easily abandon. It created fixed resources, land that could be owned, fields that could be measured, herds that could be counted. Once you can say this is ours in a literal concrete way, someone else can say we want it. It enabled surplus. Stored grain doesn't just feed you, it feeds guards, chiefs, specialists. It lets some people devote time to planning raids or building defences instead of hunting. Surplus is the economic foundation of both armies and walls. It sharpened identities. People began to think of themselves less as small mobile bands and more as villages, lineages, cultures tied to particular territories. A threat to your land became a threat to your very existence as a group. But none of this made war inevitable. The same surplus that fed raiders could feed traders, priests, healers. The same dense communities that might produce conflict could also produce elaborate rituals for peacekeeping, marriage alliances, shared festivals that bound villages together. Snatches of this alternative path show up in places like Çatalhöyük, or in long-distance exchange networks that moved obsidian, shells and pigments across hundreds of miles in the Neolithic world. Some farming societies seem to have leaned hard into cooperation, building complex kinship webs and ritual practices to diffuse tension. Others, like the LBK communities around Talheim, may have found themselves trapped in escalating cycles of revenge, each raid answered by a counter-raid, until one village disappeared into a pit. By 6000 BC the seeds had been planted, not just seeds of wheat and barley, but seeds of something darker, fortifications, massacres, remembered grievances tied to land and lineage. At the same time, those same fields were feeding new forms of art, architecture, religion, and social complexity. Agriculture didn't simply turn humans into killers. It created a world where killing could be organized, resourced, remembered, a world where for the first time you could not only lose your life, but lose your home, your harvest, your inherited place in the landscape. In the next chapter, as metals begin to shine and elites start to rise, those quiet Neolithic experiments in defense and aggression will harden into something more familiar. Not just raids and ambushes, warriors, weapons built for nothing else, and the first people who could send others to die in their name. Picture a quiet night on the edge of a Neolithic village, somewhere around 4800 BC. You still see the old world everywhere. Mud brick houses, woven fences, stone tools stacked neatly by the doorway, bone awls, flint arrowheads, polished stone axes hanging in places of honour. But in the half-light of a hearth, in one particular house, something new is cooling on a flat stone. It's small, only the length of a hand, a little uneven, edges not quite sharp. It doesn't look like much, but it's made of metal, a copper dagger, and that tiny imperfect object is going to change everything. Because stone is democratic. If your group has access to decent rock and a decent flint knapper, you can arm most of the adults. You can learn the skill by watching, practicing, failing, trying again. Any village can, in theory, make its own weapons. Metal is different. To get the copper dagger, someone had to know where copper-bearing rock were. They had to recognize strange green and blue stains in cliff faces or riverbeds. They had to dig, carry stone, build hotter fires than a normal cooking hearth, experiment with furnace shapes and airflow, work out how to turn rock into liquid metal. Then they had to learn which alloys worked better. How to hammer and anneal, how to pour into moulds. It's not just hitting rocks anymore. It's chemistry, engineering, and secret knowledge rolled into one. And in that shift from stone to metal, the story of war changes too. Because as metallurgy spreads between 5000 and 3500 BC, weapons stop being things almost anyone can make and start becoming things that only some people can control. And the people who control the weapons begin to control everyone else. At first, copper tools aren't obviously military. They're ornaments, small axes for ceremonial use, pins, awls, and spiral bracelets. Copper isn't hard enough to outperform the best flint for chopping wood or cutting hides. A well-made stone axe will outlast a soft copper blade in many tasks. But weapons are never just about efficiency. They're about status, about signalling. If the village headman walks into a gathering with a gleaming copper dagger at his belt, and everyone else has rough stone knives, the message is clear. He's connected to something they aren't, to distant mines, to travelling smiths, to traders who know the routes and the risks. The first metal weapons are, in that sense, advertisements, not just of wealth, but of networks. You're not just stabbing someone with copper, you're stabbing them with 500 kilometres of trade routes, with mining camps in distant hills, with furnaces tended by people they've never met. And slowly, the metal itself improves. By around the late 4th millennium BC and parts of the Near East, people begin alloying copper with arsenic or tin, accidentally or deliberately. The result is harder, sharper, it holds an edge, bronze. For the first time, you can make long, reliable blades that won't shatter the first time they hit bone. Sword-shaped objects begin to appear, not just daggers, but elongated knives with clear stabbing or slashing potential. Weapons built from the ground up for killing humans, not just hunting animals. At the same time, something else is sharpening: social divisions. To smelt metal, you need specialists. People who don't spend all day farming, but instead spend their time learning the mysteries of ore, furnace, and flame. These specialists become valuable, mysterious, sometimes feared. You also need people to move the metal. Caravans, boats hugging coastlines, pack animals trudging along river valleys. Every step of those routes has to be negotiated, defended, sometimes fought for. Suddenly, control over a mine in the mountains isn't just nice to have, it's strategic. And when something becomes strategic, it becomes worth killing for. One of the clearest windows into this new world doesn't come from Mesopotamia or Egypt, but from the shores of the Black Sea, in what is now Bulgaria, the Varna necropolis. Around 4,504,300 BC, people here began burying their dead in a way humanity had almost never seen before. Some graves are simple: a body, a few pottery vessels, maybe a flint tool or two. Others are astonishing. Imagine a single grave containing more gold than any other burial known from this early in human history. Gold bracelets, gold beads, gold appliques sewn onto clothing, gold plates covering the body, gold crafted into elaborate ornaments whose only function seems to be display. Beside the gold, there are copper tools and weapons, axes, adzes, blades, objects that clearly required technical skill to make. The bodies in these rich graves are mostly male. They're older. Their bones show signs of physical strain, sometimes healed injuries. The grave goods suggest they controlled both wealth and violence. Were they chiefs, priests, warrior leaders? The truth is, we don't know exactly, but the pattern is unmistakable. The community is no longer burying everyone the same way. Some individuals are being treated as fundamentally more important than others. Their metal tools and ornaments are buried with them as if those objects are part of their identity, not just their property. Many researchers think the Varna burials mark an early stage of social stratification linked to metallurgy and perhaps to organized violence. Those with access to metal, who can command the work of miners, smiths and traders, become a new kind of elite. And when elites appear, so do people whose job is to enforce their will. Specialist warriors. Not just farmers who sometimes fight, but fighters whose status comes from their ability to use these new weapons and from their connection to the people who control metal. The archaeological record doesn't show standing armies yet, but you can see the outline of something new, a triangle of power, metal, elites, warriors, and all three begin to move. While societies like Varna are flourishing around the Black Sea far to the east, on the open steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas, another transformation is underway. The Yamnaya, around 3,300 to 2,800 BC, steppe pastoralists associated with the Yamnaya horizon expand dramatically across Eastern Europe and beyond. They bring with them a package of innovations, mobile herding economies, wagon technology, possibly the early use of horseback riding, and a distinctive burial tradition of kurgans, earthen mounds covering graves. Their arrival coincides with major genetic shifts in many European populations. Ancient DNA studies show that in some regions, Yamnaya-related ancestry becomes dominant within a relatively short time. Male lineages in particular show strong replacement patterns, suggesting that the incoming groups weren't simply blending peacefully with local farmers. How violent was this process? Direct battlefield scenes are rare for this period, but the hints are there. Yamnaya graves contain weapons, stone and early metal-tipped spearheads, battle axes, and later, in related cultures, specialized battle axes so common that archaeologists name entire traditions after them. Mass graves in some regions show trauma consistent with interpersonal violence, skull fractures, arrow wounds, blows to the back of the head. At the same time, fortified settlements appear, ditches, palisades, defensive positions overlooking rivers and valleys. This doesn't mean every encounter was war. Yamnaya groups likely married into local populations, traded, formed alliances, and adopted local customs in many places. But the overall picture looks less like quiet diffusion, and more like a series of hard pushes. Mobile herders moving into already occupied farming zones, conflicts over grazing land, water sources, and control of movement corridors. Some communities survive by merging, others perhaps don't survive at all. One particular grave, far from the steppe, gives this expansion a painfully human face. Uhlau, Germany, around 2600 BC. Archaeologists uncover a small group burial, 4 individuals, their bodies arranged in a way that stops everyone for a moment. A man, a woman, 2 children. Their hands are touching, arms intertwined, faces turned toward each other. Their bones tell a story. The adults and at least one child are related, a nuclear family. Their skulls and bones show signs of violent death, blows from stone weapons, arrow injuries. Nearby, other graves contain more individuals, also killed violently, possibly at the same time. Many of the dead are from the same small community. Others, based on isotope and genetic data, came from outside. Maybe in-laws, maybe marriage partners from neighbouring groups. This isn't a battlefield. It's an aftermath, a raid, a village attack, a fight over land, livestock or honour. We can't say for sure, but it's not an accident. These people were killed by other people, together, and deliberately buried with care. And importantly, Uhlau sits in a world where metal and long-distance trade are already reshaping everything. By this time, copper and early bronze are moving along vast routes from mines in the Alps, the Carpathians, the Balkans, and the Caucasus. Amber is travelling from the Baltic coast down to Central Europe. Seashells are moving inland. Flint from famous sources is appearing hundreds of kilometres from home. Each of these routes is a lifeline. For the communities controlling them, trade means wealth. Grain in, metal out, livestock in, ornaments out, exotic goods used to cement alliances, pay bride wealth, and display status. But every lifeline is also a fault line. The same path that carries copper ingots can carry raiders. The same coastal inlets that shelter trading boats can shelter war canoes. The same mountain passes that guide caravans also channel surprise attacks. Metal doesn't just build networks of exchange, it builds corridors of vulnerability. If your village lies on a key route, you're valuable and exposed. Control over a copper mine or a choke point along a river may mean the difference between rich graves full of gold and poor graves with nothing, between a community that lives under the protection of warriors and one that lives under their boots. By 3500 BC, the world that began with a single cooling copper dagger has transformed into something sharper, harder, and more dangerous. We see richly furnished graves like Varna, announcing the presence of a new elite. We see steppe expansions like the Yamnaya, suggesting that entire populations are on the move, sometimes violently. We see intimate tragedies like Uhlau, where families die together in events that feel a lot like small-scale war. We see trade networks that once carried obsidian and shells now carrying metal, and with metal, the potential for lethal superiority. And somewhere in this tangle of minds, traders, chiefs, and killers, the idea of a warrior begins to harden into a role, a status, a way of life. The age of metal is still young. Cities are only just beginning to flicker into existence. Kingdoms and empires remain in the future. But the edge has been forged. In the next chapter, we'll watch what happens when that edge is taken up not just by chiefs and raiders, but by the first true states, societies that can tax, draft and plan war the way they plan harvests. The bronze blade is ready. Now it's time for someone to wield it. Picture this. You're no longer in a wandering band or a sleepy little farming village. You're standing on packed earth, on a raised platform of sun-baked mud brick, looking out over something the world has almost never seen before. A city. Below you, in the dawn light, the land is flat. A wide brown plain cut by the slow muddy curves of two great rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, early Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. What used to be scattered hamlets and irrigation ditches has fused into something bigger, denser, louder. Thousands of people crammed into a few square kilometres, narrow lanes between multi-storey houses, courtyards, workshops, storage yards stacked with jars of grain and dates, pens full of sheep and goats, the constant background hum of voices, hammers, grinding stones. You can smell it. Smoke from cooking fires, the sour dust of dried mud brick, the heavy scent of sweat in narrow streets, and over everything, the faint wetness of river water moving through canals that snake between fields. This is Uruk, or something very much like it, one of the first true cities in human history. From up here you can see the walls, thick, high, running in a rough ring around the city. Not a little wooden palisade around a village, but massive fortifications built from millions of mud bricks. They don't just keep animals out, they keep people out, and people in. Those walls tell you something important. This new form of life, this experiment in density and hierarchy is dangerous, not just because of disease or famine or floods, but because of other humans. For hundreds of thousands of years, violence had been personal. A fight over food, a raid on another camp, a spear thrown in anger or fear. Even in the agricultural villages of Chapter 7, most conflict was still small-scale. Skirmishes, feuds, raiding seasons. But now, around 3500 BC, something is changing. The scale of human organization is changing, and violence is changing with it. You can almost feel it in the architecture. Inside the walls, a new kind of power has taken shape. Temples that tower above the houses, built in stepped platforms, ziggurats in embryonic form, officials moving through courtyards with clay tablets in their hands, a king, or something close to it, surrounded by retainers, guards, and priests. This is no longer just a village chief with more cows than his neighbours. This is a ruler who controls grain stores big enough to feed thousands, irrigation systems that stretch for miles, and armed men who no longer farm full-time. The first standing armies are beginning to appear. They're not professional in the modern sense. Most of these men still go back to their fields after campaign season, but when the city calls, they assemble, not as a loose mob of farmers with clubs, but in formations, units, files of spear-carrying soldiers, each with a place to stand and an order to follow. For the first time in human history, killing is becoming a job. We don't just infer this from ruins. The people of this age began to carve their wars into stone. Imagine walking into a temple storeroom in ancient Sumer and finding it there, leaning against a wall, the stele of the vultures, It's a tall limestone slab carved on both sides, dating to around 2400 BC, slightly later than our 3500 and 3000 window, but close enough to show where things were heading. On one face you see the city god Ningirsu clutching enemies in a net. On the other, a human king, Eanatum of Lagash. His soldiers march in tight ranks, helmets on their heads, spears bristling, shields overlapping. Look closely at those soldiers. They're not just individuals fighting as they feel. They're arranged, synchronized, commanded. Their spears point forward in a disciplined line. Trampled beneath their feet, enemies lie piled up. Above, vultures wheel in the sky, flying away with severed heads and limbs clutched in their claws. This is not a random raid. It's a campaign, a planned, organized act of collective violence sanctified by gods, recorded in stone. The stele commemorates a border war between two city-states, Lagash and Umma, over a strip of irrigated land. Not just for cattle, but for fields, canals, and the tax revenue they produced. Suddenly, war isn't just about revenge or prestige. It's about territory, water, labour, and grain, resources that can feed a growing bureaucracy and pay for more soldiers. A few hundred years earlier, and a few hundred miles to the west, another artifact was already hinting at the same transformation. The Nama palette. Travel now, in your mind, from the flat plains of Mesopotamia to the long green ribbon of the Nile, sometime around 3100 BC. Egypt is still a patchwork of small kingdoms, Upper Egypt in the south, Lower Egypt in the north, with its marshes and delta. The Nama palette is a ceremonial cosmetic palette, carved from dark stone and found buried in a temple at Hierakonpolis. It's about the size of a laptop, but what it shows is enormous. On one side, a king, probably Nama himself, wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. He towers over a kneeling enemy, arm raised, mace ready to strike the fatal blow. Behind him stands a sandal-bearer, a servant whose only job is to carry the royal footwear. Above, a falcon representing the god Horus grips a human head attached to papyrus stalks, a symbol of the conquest of Lower Egypt. Flip the palette over and Nama now wears the red crown of the north, inspecting rows of decapitated bodies, their heads neatly placed between their legs. Standard bearers march before him. Mythic beasts with intertwined necks suggest the unification of the two lands under one ruler. It's graphic, it's theatrical, and it's political. This isn't just a record that a battle happened. It's an argument carved in stone. That war, and the killing of other humans, is the foundation of kingship itself. That the king's right to rule comes from his ability to defeat enemies, unify territories, and control violence on a massive scale. But behind the showy symbolism of stele and palettes, there's something quieter, more administrative, emerging in the background. Writing. If you walk through the ruins of Uruk in your imagination and peer into the cool interior of a temple storeroom, you'd see clay tablets stacked like little bricks, marks pressed into them with reed styluses. At first, most of these aren't stories or hymns, they're lists, barley rations, beer allotments, counts of livestock, names of workers, deliveries for the temple, receipts. The earliest writing in Mesopotamia, around 3300 to 3200 BC, seems almost painfully boring. But those little marks are the bones of something enormous. If you can track grain, you can track men. If you can list workers, you can list soldiers. If you can count offerings to the gods, you can count war captives and tribute. Over time, the same system that recorded barley for the temple begins to record something else. Conquests, treaties, enemy cities, divine justifications for war. Kings boast on clay tablets, and later on stone. I defeated so-and-so. I captured this many prisoners. I raised these walls. The bureaucracy that arose to manage canals and grain stores could just as easily manage campaigns and garrisons. Scribes who tallied taxes could tally dead enemies. The same city that invented accounting was inventing organized war, and the walls kept growing. Uruk, Ur, Kish, Nippur, one by one, cities across Sumer ring themselves with fortifications. The archaeological layers show fortification walls thickening, towers being added, gates becoming more complex. Some researchers think floods or bandits were part of the reason, but the pattern is hard to ignore. In a landscape packed with rival city-states, a city without walls is an invitation. From inside, the walls are protection. From the outside, they are a challenge. You can hear it in the stories that come later. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero doesn't brag first about his strength or his courage. He brags about the walls of Uruk, how high they are, how well built. The city itself becomes a weapon, an armor plating of baked clay and organized labor. But if you want to see how far organized killing has come in only a few centuries, you don't just look at walls. You look at something found in a royal tomb at Ur dating to around 2600 BC, right at the edge of our period. A wooden box inlaid with shell, lapis lazuli and red stone. It's called the Standard of Ur. It probably wasn't actually a military standard. Nobody is sure what it was used for. But its images are a window into the new reality of war. On one side, labelled by modern scholars as the war side, you see a sequence of panels. At the bottom, chariots, or proto-chariots, four-wheeled wagons drawn by donkeys, roll over fallen enemies. The animals are shown mid-gallop, trampling bodies under their hooves. In the middle row, infantry advance, spears raised, wearing what look like cloaks or armour, leading naked captives by ropes. At the top, the king sits higher than everyone else, facing a line of prisoners. Some are kneeling, some are being presented like offerings. Flip the box, and on the peace side the same king sits at a banquet, drinking with his elite companions while servants bring food and musicians play. War on one side, peace on the other, violence, then feasting, conquest, then redistribution. This is the new rhythm of early states. Campaign season brings out the armies. The king leads, or at least claims to. Victories bring back captives, cattle, precious metals and grain. The spoils are then used to feed the city, reward supporters, and fund temples. War is no longer an interruption of normal life. It is a method of redistribution, a pillar of the political system. In this world, raiding is slowly becoming something else. It's not just about grabbing what you can and running. It's about permanently taking over irrigated land, canals and villages. It's about turning enemies into taxpayers, forced labourers and vassals. Violence is being transformed into an institution. You can feel the difference in how people talk about it. Earlier, we attacked them might have been the story. Now it becomes, the god ordered us to march. The king subdued the four corners of the world. This field was granted to our city by divine decree. War is being wrapped in law, myth, and administration. Even the way armies move is changing. Before, a raid might be a few dozen men, maybe a couple hundred slipping in at dawn and disappearing by night. Now, rulers are coordinating thousands of bodies across days and weeks. They're stockpiling grain ahead of time, they're planning routes, building boats, assigning soldiers to different wings of an army. Without writing, without some kind of central record-keeping, this kind of logistics would be nearly impossible. With writing, it becomes normal. The same clay tablet that lists rations for temple workers can list rations for troops. Not every scholar thinks writing was invented for war. Many argue it began for economic accounting. Others see religious donations as the core driver. But once it existed, war quickly became one of its favourite subjects. The clay doesn't lie. It shows us kings recording their victories in cuneiform wedges. It shows us treaties scratched into wet tablets. It shows us lists of foreign lands that owe tribute and lists of soldiers assigned to particular units. By 3000 BC, across Mesopotamia and along the Nile, humans have created something entirely new. Societies where large-scale, organised, bureaucratically managed war is not a rare catastrophe, but a recurring feature of political life. The walls, the stelae, the palettes, the standards, the tablets, all of them whisper the same thing. Killing has stepped out of the shadows of necessity and revenge. It's becoming a tool of the state, something planned, financed, recorded, and remembered. In earlier chapters, violence was a possibility at the edge of life. Here, in the first cities, it begins to move toward the centre. And yet, even as armies march and kings carve their victories in stone, something else is happening in the night. Stories are being told, myths of flood and creation, tales of heroes and monsters. People sit under the same stars their ancestors watched 500,000 years ago, wondering if this new world of walls and war is really progress, or just a different kind of cage. Because as powerful as these early states seem, they are fragile. One bad harvest, one rebellion, one enemy king who builds higher walls or trains more disciplined troops, and everything can fall. The age of organized warfare has dawned. But the question of what it means for human nature, whether this is who we truly are, or just one path we took, still hangs in the air, unanswered, as the armies of the Bronze Age march into the dark. So, after 500,000 years of bones, blades, and buried secrets, what picture actually emerges of us? Because if you came into this story with the old idea in your head, the killer ape, the notion that humans are just murder machines wrapped in language and tools, this history doesn't really support that. And if you came in with the opposite story, that humans were once gentle, egalitarian, peaceful children of nature, corrupted only recently by civilization, the evidence doesn't really support that either. What we've seen is something more unsettling and more hopeful. We are not born killers. We are not born pacifists. We are born conditional. Our biology gives us the capacity for extreme violence and astonishing cooperation. What actually happens depends on the world we build around ourselves. Think back over the whole arc of this timeline. For hundreds of thousands of years, there's almost no clear evidence of organized killing. Individual homicides, maybe. Dangerous fights, almost certainly. But not war. Not the systematic, planned killing of groups by other groups. The bones don't show it. The sites don't show it. The weapons aren't there. When people were few, resources were patchy, and groups were small and mobile, our ancestors seem to have solved most conflicts with fission. You just leave. You walk away. You split the band. You find another valley. Only much later, when numbers grow, when land starts to matter, when food can be stored, when leaders and lineages and reputations start to lock into place, only then do we see something that looks like war. That pattern tells us something crucial. Violence isn't just something that bubbles up from inside us, inevitably, like steam from boiling water. It's something that emerges when certain conditions line up. Think about those conditions. First, resources. You don't get real war without something to fight over that you can't easily replace. In the Mesolithic, it's rich river valleys full of fish, shellfish, migratory herds. In the early Neolithic, it's grain fields, orchards, grazing land. In the Bronze Age, it's metal deposits, trade routes, irrigated farmland, slaves. When food is unpredictable but people are highly mobile, the best strategy is to move. When food becomes predictable but tied to specific places, fields, herds, storage pits, irrigation systems, then defending territory starts to make sense. and once you start defending, the option of attacking is never far behind. Second, population. 10 people can be angry, 50 can be hostile, but you don't get armies of hundreds or thousands without dense settlements, surplus food and social structures that can coordinate large numbers of people. The first fortified villages, the first mass graves full of weapon injuries, the first depictions of organized combat all appear when population density crosses a certain invisible threshold. Below that line, conflict is personal. Above it, conflict can become structural. Third, social organization. War needs more than weapons. It needs stories. It needs an us and a them. It needs leaders who can convince young people to risk their lives for abstract things. Honor, gods, ancestors, a king, a city, a flag. Hunter-gatherer bands rarely produce those abstractions at a large scale. Their us is small, a few dozen kin, maybe a few neighbouring groups linked by marriage and exchange. Their leadership is fluid, respect-based, often suspicious of anyone who tries to rise too far above the rest. But once you have clans, chiefs, lineages, courts, temples, palaces, then the us can expand, and so can the them. Then you can mobilize people you've never met to kill other people they've never met, for reasons most of them only vaguely understand. So if you imagine human nature as a kind of toolkit that evolution gave us, war is not a fixed setting. It's more like a particular combination of tools that only gets assembled under specific circumstances. Anthropologists studying recent hunter-gatherers give us a clearer glimpse of what many of our ancestors probably looked like before those conditions emerged. Among groups like the Hadza of Tanzania, the Juhoansi in southern Africa, some Australian Aboriginal groups before colonisation, and Arctic foragers in earlier centuries, we see patterns that repeat. They argue. They get jealous. They sometimes fight, sometimes even kill. Homicide exists. Revenge exists. But large-scale, organised warfare, planned campaigns, multi-group coalitions, raids for land or long-term domination, is rare to non-existent in the most mobile, least hierarchical bands. Conflicts often end with avoidance, mediation, or fission. One subgroup simply packs up and leaves. Food is shared widely, especially meat. Harmony is valued not because people are saints, but because in a group of 30, every rupture is dangerous. If 2 hunters hate each other, everyone's children may starve. The cost of open, ongoing conflict is just too high. Some forager groups do raid, especially where they border farmers or herders, or where colonial disruption has pushed them into new forms of competition. Others show cycles of retaliation killings. There is no pure Eden. But the baseline isn't constant war. It's a fragile, negotiated peace, always under tension, but real. That fragile peace may be much closer to the world of our Paleolithic ancestors than the battlefields of Bronze Age kings or the trench lines of the 20th century. If that's true, then a darker implication follows. War is not carved into us by evolution as a permanent, unchanging instinct. It's something we invented, more than once, in more than one place. A cultural technology that got built on top of older emotional systems: fear, anger, loyalty, grief, pride, love. And if war is something we created, not something that created us, then it is not inevitable. That doesn't mean it's easy to get rid of. Tools, once invented, don't disappear just because we don't like them. The same cognitive gifts that built grandparent care, song, shared stories, art and medicine also built fortresses and killing fields. But inevitability is a specific claim. It means no matter what we do, no matter how we arrange our societies, large-scale organised violence will always be there. The archaeological record doesn't quite support that. For long stretches of time, in many places, it seems our ancestors lived without it, or with it at such a low level that it left little trace. Then, under certain pressures, ecological, demographic, political, war flared up, took hold, became self-sustaining. So the hopeful interpretation is not that humans are secretly peaceful angels, it's that we're highly flexible, given certain structures, inequality, rigid hierarchies, scarcity, fear-driven ideologies, tribal identities stretched across millions. We're capable of industrial-scale slaughter, given different structures, ability, flatter hierarchies, strong norms against dominance, robust conflict mediation, shared rituals of reconciliation. We are capable of long periods where killing is rare and war is unknown. This matters for the present, because we now live in conditions our ancestors never faced. Populations in the billions, weapons that can end civilization in an afternoon, states that span continents, ideologies that can spread at the speed of light. But under all that, the same nervous systems are humming away. The same brain circuits that once coordinated a small band on a dangerous hunt are now coordinating financial systems, cyber armies, global information networks. The question is not, are humans violent or peaceful? The question is, which parts of our nature are we choosing to cultivate, and which conditions are we allowing to take root? When we build societies that concentrate power in the hands of a few, that reward domination, that allow vast inequalities, that train children to see whole categories of people as less than human, we are setting up the same kinds of conditions that made early warfare adaptive for chiefs and kings. When we build societies that reduce extreme scarcity, that invest in fair systems of conflict resolution, that value dignity across group lines, that give people real stakes in cooperation, we're pushing in the other direction, toward the long, quieter stretches in the archaeological record where mass graves disappear and fortifications crumble back into the earth. The deep history you've just travelled through doesn't let us off the hook by blaming either human nature or civilization alone. It says, you're descended from people who could endure almost anything. Ice ages, supervolcano winters, near-extinction bottlenecks. You carry in your body the legacy of minds that learn to share, to sing, to care for the sick and the old, to bury the dead with flowers and tools. You also carry the potential to draw lines on the ground and say, this is ours, and to kill those on the other side. Both are real, both are human. So maybe the most important question isn't, are we violent or peaceful? Maybe the question is, what do we want to be now that we understand where war actually came from? If war is older than writing but younger than humanity, if it arose from particular arrangements of land, power and fear, then it's not some ancient god we have to obey. It's a choice, a recurring one. Every law we pass, every border we draw, every story we tell about us and them nudges that choice one way or the other. Long before the first city walls rose, long before the first chariots rolled across the plains, small bands of humans sat around fires, under cold stars, deciding how to treat their neighbours, how to share water, how to raise their children. In that sense, we are still sitting around that fire. Only now the fire is the whole planet. So as you drift towards sleep, after this long journey from stone tools to standing armies, you might hold one final thought. War did not sculpt our hands. It did not fuse our chromosomes. It did not give us language or love or the need to hold each other when the night is long. We created war. We taught it to ourselves. We passed it down. What does it mean for our future that the most terrifying thing we face is not something nature forced upon us, but something we built with our own astonishing, dangerous, creative minds? So now, at the end of this long walk through deep time, you're lying here in the dark with a head full of ghosts. We started 500,000 years ago when the world was colder, harsher, emptier, when there were no cities, no armies, no written records. just scattered bands of early humans and near humans, moving through grasslands and forests, watching the sky, listening for predators, trying not to starve. We followed them through the great bottleneck when our entire lineage almost vanished, through that narrow passage where maybe only 1,000 breeding individuals carried our story forward, through Neanderthal valleys and Denisovan mountains, through the first careful burials, the first deliberate tools, the first hints that our minds were becoming something new. We watched as language thickened, as alliances formed, as small conflicts flickered like sparks in dry grass. We traced the slow shift from rare, local violence to something more systematic. Hunters arguing at a kill site, a raid on a neighbouring group, a settlement burned, arrowheads lodged in bone. We came down from the Ice Age into the green, unstable world of the Mesolithic, when coasts flooded and rivers changed course, and humans learned to live off fish, birds, and forests. We saw the first clear mass graves, the first evidence that killing wasn't just a personal dispute anymore. It could be group against group. Then we crossed into the agricultural revolution. The fields, the granaries, the walls, the first real surplus, and with it, the first real things to steal. Land that could be owned, borders that could be defended, people who could be ordered into battle. We watched as metal appeared, as copper turned to bronze, and stone blades gave way to blades made for nothing but cutting human flesh, as chiefs and proto-kings turned warriors into professions, as monuments rose and along with them the need to control labour, territory and tribute. By the time we reached the threshold of recorded history around 3000 BC, the pattern was set. War was no longer an accident of circumstance. It was an institution. Something societies could plan for, invest in, even celebrate. But all along this path, behind every skeleton in a trench, every arrowhead in a spine, every burned village layer in the soil, there were people. Not just ancients, not just hominins. People. Someone who held a child's hand while they crossed a river. Someone who sat by a fire telling a story about an ancestor who survived the Great Cold. Someone who hesitated before throwing a spear at a stranger who looked, in some deep way, exactly like them. Every flint point you heard about tonight was napped by fingers that got cut and blistered. Every burial we mentioned was a moment when somebody stopped, knelt in the dirt and decided that a body shouldn't just be left for scavengers. Every early village was full of voices, arguments, jokes, quiet moments of tenderness we will never see. The evidence we have is thin. A fractured skull here, a fortified settlement there, a mass grave with bound wrists, a wall built thicker than it needed to be. From these fragments, we try to reconstruct why humans began killing each other in organised ways. But the truth is, we're still peering through a keyhole. We don't know the exact words spoken before the first raid. We don't know what myths early farmers told themselves to justify taking a neighbour's field. We don't know whether the people in those graves died for revenge, for fear, for resources, or for reasons we haven't even imagined. What we do know is that war wasn't inevitable from the start. For far longer than humans have been waging organised battles, our ancestors lived in small groups, negotiating, trading, splitting apart, coming together again. Violence existed, but it took hundreds of thousands of years and a whole chain of technological and social shifts for it to harden into what we'd recognise as war. And that means something important. The way we live now is not the only way humans have ever lived. It's just one outcome of a long, tangled story. As you lie here, you're part of that story. You carry the genes of hunters who refused to quit, foragers who memorized every waterhole, mothers who kept children alive through lean seasons, fathers and siblings and elders who chose, again and again, to share knowledge instead of hoarding it. you also carry the legacy of those who fought, took, defended, and sometimes killed. Both sides are in you, in all of us. If your eyes are getting heavy now, you can let that thought be a kind of lullaby. You are the end point for this moment of 500,000 years of choices, cooperation and conflict, care and cruelty, fear and courage. And somewhere back there, sitting around a fire under unfamiliar stars, there was someone who wondered what kind of a world their distant descendants would live in. Tonight, that's you. Thank you for walking this road with me, from the shadowy 500,000 year mark all the way to the edge of written history, for letting your mind drift across glaciers and savannas, stone tools and bronze blades, the first whispers of war, and the stubborn persistence of human hope. If you found this journey calming, interesting, or thought-provoking, you can gently tap like, or leave a comment. Maybe tell us where in the world you're listening from, or which part of this long timeline stayed with you. If you'd like to hear more stories like this about deep time and human origins and the hidden threads behind our modern world, you can subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you want to support this kind of long-form, carefully researched content a little more directly, there's an option to join our channel membership here on YouTube. That's completely optional, only if it feels right for you and never necessary. For now, you don't need to do anything. Just let the noise of the present fade a little. Imagine a fire burning low in a cave or in a clearing beside a river that no longer exists. Imagine distant ancestors settling down for the night, listening to the wind, trusting that, for one more dark stretch of hours at least, they are safe. You're lying in the same darkness they knew, under the same stars, part of the same fragile, stubborn species that somehow made it through every disaster, every war, every mistake. Let your thoughts slow. Let the timeline blur. And if sleep comes, let it carry you gently back through that long human story we all share. Good night. Rest well, descendant of survivors.